Hi everybody, good to see you. So I need to start off with an admission. I like to think of my talks as free therapy. So I have to admit that I'm a really sad human being. I really love puzzles. I do number puzzles loads. Anyone else out there like their number puzzles? Who in here are developers? Any devs in here? So you solve problems, just not always number problems. When I got to develop day-to-day, I didn't do a lot of number puzzles. Now that I do more people stuff, I do a lot more number puzzles. It's my sense of actually achieving and doing and solving. Not that people problems are easy. But I'm even sadder than just liking number puzzles. I also like statistics. And I also like politics. I also like lots of other things. They're just not relevant to this particular talk. Astrophysics, all sorts of stuff. If you want to talk to me about anything sad, I'm really, really open for that. So this talk actually came out of, there was a lot of discussion around the budget last year, autumn time, around the productivity puzzle in the UK. And the overall UK, we've got low productivity, it's not growing the way that we would want it to, and why is that? Liking stats, liking politics, liking puzzles, it all just seemed perfect. So this is actually labour productivity in the UK from 1972. And you can see that it's followed actually a pretty similar trajectory for most of that time. You can also see some of the problems that we've had during recessions in the past. So 1991 recession, you can see a bit of a dip, but then it comes back up and it carries on along that same trajectory. You can see here the difference when it hit the financial crisis this time. So pretty much it's been flat since then. So there's been lots of excitement. In the spring statement, I told you I was sad on politics. They talked about the last 2 quarters of productivity growth. Yay. That's this bit here. Okay, just to put it in context. So why do we even care? Well, it's a really good predictor of GDP growth, productivity growth, or has been historically, but also real income growth. And we can see that now as well. We've been talking about in the news a lot about the fact that real incomes haven't been growing in the UK. And this would be argued, certainly from traditional views, as one of the reasons for that. Okay, I need to warn you throughout this, I'm going to ask you some random questions that will come together at the end, I promise you. But at the moment, first random question. So think about a ladder with steps from 0 to 10. Okay, so there are 11 steps from 0 to 10. 0 at the bottom, 10 at the top. The top of the ladder represents the best possible life for you. And the bottom of the ladder represents the worst possible life for you. Which of those steps would you be on? I'm not going to ask you to share. It's not your therapy session, it's mine. But just have a think about which of those steps you would be on. Okay. So how do we measure productivity? That's my first question when I start to hear about the productivity puzzle, all these things going on. So pretty basically, it's output over input. So if we think about from a country point of view, labour productivity, which is what the government's talking about when they talk about their productivity level, there's a few different ways. So gross domestic product, that's the total amount that we make as a country. So that's the type of thing that is often measured. Divided by the number of workers, that's the way that we used to do labour productivity. It's a little more complex now because number of workers is a bit too gross, you know, sort of how many of those are part-time workers? How does that really fit in? So now labour productivity is gross domestic product divided by the hours worked in order to achieve that gross domestic product. So that's how we, as a country, measure our labour productivity. So you start to hit problems. As you get more and more self-employed people, how does that play in? What are our assumptions underneath the average number of hours worked by a particular person, particular industry? industry, and do those actually tie up and through? What happens when we start offshoring more? Getting more, so let's think about software. If actually we get our software developed in India, well, we get the gross domestic product for that, but we don't necessarily have the labour input for that. So if we start, you can start to see how these measures aren't actually necessarily that useful. And also, is gross domestic product really our output? It's just financial. What about, I mean, how in the UK particularly do we value healthcare, for example? How does that contribute to our GDP? So there's all sorts of problems with the measure. Trying to solve the puzzle, a number of people have come up with a number of reasons why they think that we're not recovering. So one of those is around lack of investment. At the moment, labour is cheap. And if labour is cheap, why would we go out there and try to actually increase our efficiency? We can just bring more people in instead of actually investing in new machinery or whatever in order to improve our productivity. We're also, one of the theories that's been put forward is that we're reaching the end of our productivity that's come in because of computing power. So if we look at something like how supply chains have been improved and made more efficient through the computing that we can do, we're coming towards the end of that. Probably as a technology person, I'm a little biased, but I don't think that's true. Just personal. There's also, one interesting one is a service-based economy. As we become more and more service-based, will this traditional model that's looking at productivity actually tie through? Surely the productivity of a person, providing healthcare as an example, is linear. You know, it's that person, they're coming in, they're helping to care for people, they're doing things. How do you make that more efficient? And actually, do you want to? So perhaps this productivity puzzle is actually partly because we're changing nature as the type of country that we are and the type of work that we do. So next random question. Again, from 0 to 10, overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? So just have a bit of a think on that and decide what your answer is. Overall, how satisfied are you with your life? Okay. Productivity. So output over input, really that's the efficiency of us obtaining our outcomes. If I'm going to put that in words rather than rather than in just a formula. So who can tell me measures of productivity that we use in Agile?
Velocity.
Velocity. Any others?
Time.
Say again, sorry?
Cycle time.
Cycle time. Throughput. Okay, let's look at velocity first. So velocity, number of points we've done, whatever our definition of done is, divided by the number of iterations that we took to do it. Often over the last 3 iterations, we take the rolling average. Is that a measure of efficiency of obtaining outcomes?
No, that's just output.
It's output, but it's not outcomes. In fact, I might argue it's not even output. If we look at this top one, this is an estimate of the amount of work. The points are an estimate in an indirect way of the amount of work that we think that is, of complexity, of work level. So on the top of there is actually an input. It's our estimate of how much work it's going to be. But actually, what did we achieve over that time? This is not a measure of productivity, and it's used so often as a measure of productivity in Agile. I had one team that I went to run a retrospective for. So the Scrum Master asked me to go and run their retrospective and see what was going on, because they were a failing team, okay? Every time they committed to 45 points of work in the next iteration, and every time they failed, they were a failing team. They kept achieving about 30. They knew they were failing. Everyone knew they were failing. And when I ran that retrospective, it turned out that the Scrum Master knew the dates that the overall large release had to be done by, the amount of work that was in there, had worked out 45 points was the velocity they had to have, and had told the team. This is when it becomes, it's not, instead of using that and actually getting that out and understanding, actually this team can achieve 30 points. That's their velocity. So let's ask the question, what can we do? If we have to deliver that by that time, let's actually look at the issues. Do we have another team? Do we do other things? Do we change the time? Do we change the scope? Instead of having those conversations, the team was being beaten over the head for not being productive enough. So I would say that velocity is about predictability. That's really what you're trying to do. You're trying to discover predictability. One of the other things that you guys came up with was cycle time. I don't have that on my list, so I'll talk about that now. So cycle time is, it's a measure from the time we start work to the time we finish work. So it's the average of how long it takes us to start our work to how long it takes us to finish our work. Is that efficiency of obtaining outcomes? Oh, I should have warned you at the start. This is a conversation. Just think, if you don't want a conversation, you should probably head on. Do you think that's, no, I don't either. Again, that's about, it's not about outcomes at all. There's nothing in there about outcomes. Okay. Another random question. Overall, how happy did you feel yesterday? 0 to 10. Okay. So here's some other measures that people talk about. Story completion ratio and story point completion ratio, which are roughly the same thing. How many stories did we complete versus the number we thought we were going to complete in this iteration, or points? Is this a measure of productivity? Is there an efficiency of obtaining outcomes? Is that the purpose of this? No? This is, how good is the team at estimating? That's really the question that this is trying to answer. What about throughput, which we also came up with? Number of stories completed over a number of iterations. You could also have story point throughput as well if you wanted to. Is this the efficiency of obtaining outcomes? Any thoughts? No, I would say this is predictability again. This is about us trying to predict what we can do in the future. What about mean time between releases? Is this efficiency of achieving outcomes?
No.
No. It's a bit closer. It's at least more of an efficiency type thing, but it isn't. Again, I'm more interested in what value has been delivered in those. So I would say that productivity, if we look at our value we've added, divided by the input, and that's our efficiency of obtaining outcomes. So what kind of value might we have added? Any thoughts? It's quite sad at an Agile conference not to get. So, what value are you adding by releasing your software, do you hope?
Increasing the conversion rate.
Conversion rate, revenue.
Reducing the operational overhead to 40 times.
Yeah, decreasing the operational overhead. So there's lots, I've just added a couple on there, of potential things. So what I'm arguing is, when you're talking about productivity, what we really need to be looking at are the outcomes. And I don't think that we do that enough. We've become far too process-driven. And when we think about it, it's almost like we're tied into velocity and we're tied into mean time between failure and we're tied into all sorts of these things. And when we try and talk to people about those things, we're talking to them about our process. They don't care. What they care about is the outcomes. And if we actually want to reach out, we need to be talking about those. Not just that, but also we need to be talking about the outcomes to the teams. how motivating is it? So we had one project, actually failed lots. It failed really, really badly in lots of different ways, but that's not what the story's about. Once it was released, it was actually the business's favourite project that they'd worked on, and they loved it, even though it had been the most painful project for them in many ways. And when it went live, lots and lots of problems, all sorts of issues. But they loved it because it gave so much value. So it was actually a project to automate the transfer of ISAs. So individual savings account. It used to take 15 days average for someone to come maybe to a branch or phone up and say, I want to transfer my ISA to you, to those funds being in an account for them. And after this project was done, it took an average of 2 days for that to happen, for the funds to be there. Not only that, but the customer experience that that drove meant that we were being recommended by lots of people. And that was with a building society, so quite a small organisation, and it drove 2.5 million more coming in savings than we would ordinarily have had in a 6-month period. That's huge for a building society. So there was all sorts of value added that we didn't even expect necessarily to be added when we started that piece of work.
So, in a project whereby we're not yet releasing to customers or we're not yet seeing the return on ROI, how would you suggest we can measure such the value added, other than, for example, shareholder being satisfied? How would you suggest that?
So the question there is how would we measure value added when we're not actually yet releasing in and through? So, and I think the honest answer is you can't measure it at that point. You can't measure the value added when you haven't added any value. If you've not taken this live, you haven't added any value. So in that scenario, you have to revisit at a later date to measure, did we get what we expected to get? But you should at least be having the conversation, what do we expect to get? And I don't think enough of that conversation is had with the people who are doing the work, with the teams. And I guess that's part of what came out of this ISA thing, was the team that had done that got so much out of understanding the value that had brought to the organisation. And I think it's that conversation, so at least people understand exactly what the value is we expect to get, and that there are plans in place to measure it and see, did we get that? That so rarely happens. Okay, this is your last random question. Overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in life are worthwhile? So I want to bring this more to a company level now. We've sort of been talking at a country level, then we were talking at more of a team level. So I want to bring it to the company level now. And why do we care about productivity? Because it's interrelated with lots of other things. So innovation is interrelated with productivity. Productivity is interrelated with success. I'm deliberately using a very general term there. What's success? That depends what your organisation wants. It could be profitability, it could be growing the number of users, it could be anything. But whatever the definition of success is for that organisation at that point in time, at that point in their life. And these things are all interrelated. So the main driver for all of these things is actually happiness. And it's not purely just engagement within the organisation, but actually happiness levels of the people who are there. So some studies to support that. There are lots, but just to give you a few. So there was a study in 2008 that looked at the last 25 years of studies in this area and did a meta-analysis of those, and found that creativity was increased when the happiness of the workforce was higher. And creativity came along and created innovation, which helped companies come through. Also, if we think about productivity, there was one particular study in 2015 that found that happy groups were 12% more productive than unhappy groups. Now, this This wasn't in a real-world environment. This was in a study-type situation where they created something that made people happy or not happy. So you can take that with a pinch of salt, but they found that they were 12% more productive on piecework. There's also the Gallup release in 2016, the relationship between engagement and work and organisational outcomes. And it looked at companies with in the top quartile of engaged employees. So the top 25% of engagement levels compared to companies in the bottom 25% of engagement levels. And it found a 20% difference in productivity between those. And if we look at success, again, depends how you define it. Edmonds in 2014 looked at the best companies to work for survey across 14 countries and looked at the stock price of the organisations that made it into those and found a strong positive correlation between those. And that same Gallup work found that the top quartile compared to the bottom quartile of engagement, 10% increase in customer satisfaction, 21% increase in profit, 41% reduction in absenteeism, and 40% increase in quality. Now, all of these, as always, you should take with a pinch of salt. But if you look at the studies across this place and across this area, they are pretty convincing, and there are lots of them. If we look at engaged employees, so we talked about engagement earlier, there was one study that looked, so on this graph, people who are satisfied in their workplace have been set at 100, so everything's in comparison to that. So they say engaged are 144 if we look at productivity of people who are engaged with their organisation. But people who are inspired are 225. So really, what we want to understand is how do we get people to be inspired if what we're looking to do is increase our productivity. So there are a number of things that feed in. Meaning is one of them. So this is actually one of the key ones for inspiration. Finding meaning and inspiration in what the organisation does or in its mission. So if I look back at my career over the last decade, I've tended to work with and for organisations that are either public sector or who are mutual organisations, i.e. they're owned by their customers. That really gels with me, my values in life, and that lets me care more about what they do and how we do it. I care about those things. I probably care a lot less about a betting system. In fact, probably that's negative for me. So that aligning, and companies can create this more. They can really think about why they're there, what they really want to do. And it's inspiration, not just from why they're there, but also that inspirational leadership piece. It all comes into this meaning. Also, making a difference, knowing the fact that you've been there over the last few weeks, things are different than they would have been had you not been there. That's hugely important to happiness. A sense of achievement. We then look at autonomy. So the CMI did a study in 2016 which said that for managers self-reported that they were twice as productive when they had open empowering management style for them. And autonomy is actually one of the key things for engagement. So the last one was inspiration. We're now trying to achieve engagement because unless we get engagement, we can't get the inspiration level. So flow. Who in here understands flow from this context? So a few of you, all right. So really this is being challenged in a really good way, being in the flow, being in the zone, losing a sense of time and place because you're doing and you're solving and you're just so challenged in such a positive way. I love this mode. I spend far too much of my life in this mode. When I'm walking down the street, I'm thinking about something. I have no idea what's going on around me. So people have to come up to me and do this in my face if I'm walking past them in the street. I'm sure that I've lost so many potential friendships because I've just dissed someone on the street without knowing that I've done it. In fact, I so much don't know that I have been known to fall over once or twice because I'm not even spending enough attention on where I'm looking. And you'll know when I've done it. It's about every 18 months I get a really bad twisted ankle because I've kind of gone over. And I've probably been doing this as I've been walking along in the street. Told you this was my therapy. And that kind of being in the flow is intrinsically rewarding. It's rewarding just being in it. It also in this area, variety, having a variety of challenges, learning and growing every day. It's a really important part of this flow. Then we have work relationships. So it's not surprising that good work relationships increase engagement, team cohesion, feeling that you are part of a team and part of an outstanding team. Hugely important in this. And work-life balance. Knowing that you're trusted enough to actually work from home. Knowing that you've got a dentist appointment at 2 and you don't have to take a day off for that. Knowing that you can go and pick the kids up from school and your employer still knows that you're going to be doing your work, and that's absolutely fine. Super important. There was one study, I have to say it was very specific. It was on one company in China, so I'm not claiming that this is generally over, but it was looking at working from home as an example. And this company had high staff turnover, didn't allow working from home, and they introduced working from home. It wasn't an IT industry either, it was a different industry. And they found that there was higher satisfaction amongst the workers and also that attrition halved. So they reduced their cost and time in recruiting. But also they found that people were 13% more productive when they did work from home. They said 9% of that came from the fact that they were working at times where normally they might have been travelling, so they actually had a bit longer working hours. But they said that 4% came from the fact they were being interrupted less. So I wouldn't claim that that study is extendable out to everything ever, but it is quite an interesting piece of evidence around what I think a lot of us believe. I was having a conversation, in fact, just last week with somebody from an organisation, a really large organisation, which doesn't allow anyone to work from home. It's a supermarket, and the CEO's argument is that the people who are in the shops working can't work from home. So it's really unfair to let other people do it. It's a really interesting argument, but they're in competition for IT people with people who do allow people to do this. And I think they need to look at things from the point of view of getting the best technologists in that they can. But also there was a very distinct lack of trust. I was talking to this particular person about, and his arguments were basically, how do I know they're working? You know, at the end of the day, somebody who is in the office and doesn't produce much will be at home and not produce much. Somebody who's in the office and produces a lot will be at home and produce a lot. It's really not about where they are. It's about how they work and who they are, and potentially how they've been treated historically. But that's not what this talk's about. Okay, recognition. So there's lots of evidence around frequent recognition being important for people, varying the types of recognition, making them unexpected rather than it just being, you know, every Friday we say who's done a good job this week. But I think you need to think about how you recognise as well and who you're recognising. So I'm very internally referenced. That means I don't really care what anyone else thinks about what I've done as long as I believe that I've done a good job, okay? So please do go on Twitter and tell me how I've done, but I'm going to ignore it if it's bad, just so you know. My husband is incredibly externally focused. So he really cares what other people think and feel about him. And actually, he needs that to know whether or not he's done a good job. So I don't recognise him enough. And he recognises me too much. I'm like, what are you telling me for? I know that. And we are now in a great place. He tells me when he needs recognition, so I can give it, and it works quite well. But I think in the workplace as well, I fail at this. Because I'm so internally referenced, I don't always give enough external, because I think they know they've done a great job on that. So I try and work, that's one of the things I work on myself, is to try and do that more. But also one of the biggest mistakes that I've made is trying to overly recognise someone who's internally referenced. So one of the guys who worked for me had done a fantastic job on an area. And I actually put him in for an external award. And we were invited along to the award ceremony. He didn't want to go. He didn't like that it had been put forward. He didn't like that he had to wear a DJ. He didn't like any of it. And we went along and he won and he hated it. Utterly hated it because it was putting too much attention on him. All of those things, didn't like it. Now, he got over it and we worked through it, but that was a huge mistake on my behalf, trying to just put a cookie cutter on what people want from a recognition point of view. And it's so important to really think. So what did I do after that? When he'd done a good job, I gave him a bit of a nod. He liked that. And that was absolutely the right level for him. And it's caring about what is right for that person. And feedback, frequent, early feedback. How are people doing? Looking at productivity or looking at happiness, looking at how they're working through that frequent feedback. It's in with recognition, but it doesn't have to be the same thing. It can be good and bad. It can be a mixture of different routes through, but that feedback, that importance. Okay, so we have these things that feed in and through to innovation, productivity, and success at the organisational level. What else does happiness give us? So I'm a huge believer that we should care about the happiness of people who work in our organisation, irrespective of whether it gave the organisation anything. But it's always good to actually be able to show people that it does. This is one of those examples. So it actually, according to a number of studies, adds to our life expectancy. Happier people live longer. They get less cardiovascular disease. They are less likely to come down with viral infections. There's quite a lot of studies out there that tie together happiness with health. So why as an organisation should we care about this? On 7th of March this year, NHS produced a study which looked at employee engagement across England and its relationship into staff sickness levels. So they found that an average trust could save 2,000 sick days a year if they just increased their engagement level by 1 standard deviation, which is quite small. They could save 2,000 sick days, which is roughly £365,000 a year per trust. But also, it reduced the amount of time they needed from agency workers. And that saved 1.7 million on average per trust per year. So just by caring about people's health and well-being at work, there's actually fundamental money savings for organisations. So coming back to the country level, how do we measure happiness? I mean, I've been talking quite blithely away here about, happiness drives this, that, and the other, and these are the things that cause happiness. But measuring happiness, that's a really esoteric thing to do. So now we come to those random questions that I've been asking you. Those are questions that are asked in order to understand people's happiness levels. There are obviously many more than those, but those are a sample. So if we look at a few of them, the Office for National Statistics, I told you I am very sad. It's been gathering since 2010. It was given the remit of actually looking at well-being across the UK. and actually understanding it more. So a number of the questions that you had today are from them. Overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? Overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? Overall, how happy did you feel yesterday? And one I didn't ask you, overall, how anxious did you feel yesterday? And these are the results. So you can see that actually life satisfaction has been going up in the UK according to these questions and those measures. People feeling their lives are worthwhile has also been going up. Happiness levels also going up. Anxiety levels were going up, but seem to be coming down a bit. So these are people who are at the extremes. So very high rating of satisfaction, but we still only have 30% of people with a very high rating of life satisfaction in the UK. So 70 people, so there's a lot of celebration from the ONS around these things, but actually I think we need to think about the opposite as well. 70 people are not largely satisfied with their life. Worthwhile, 35% roughly. So 65% of people don't think their life's worthwhile. We should actually be asking those questions. Happiness, again, about 35%. Anxiety is, and this is the people who put their anxiety as very low, is about 40%. So we still have 60% of people who don't put their anxiety as very low. And how does the UK compare to other countries? That very first question I asked was that ladder question. And that question is actually what these are based on. So if you had your best possible life at the top and your worst possible life at the bottom, and they use the ladder, which is why I kind of put it on there, then what rung would you be on from 0 to 10? Then these are the averages from lots of different countries. In fact, there are 156 countries in this pulled together, but these are the top 20. So you can look and see where you had on compared to these other countries. Which do you think is this first country? This is the happiest country in the world. Finland, Sweden, and Norway. There's a definite sort of grouping there, isn't there? Yeah, it's Finland. It is Finland. Norway is second. Sweden's 9th. I actually didn't even need to look at my list for that. Look at that. I happen to know Sweden. So they're all on there. They are all quite high. Where's the UK? You think we're the one right on the end?
We're not in the top 20.
Or we're not in the top 20. We are in the top 20. We're not the one right on the end. We're second from the end. So we're 19th. I mean, 19 out of 156 isn't bad, to be fair, but we're 19th in our level of happiness.
Finland have one of the highest suicide rates.
I don't know, but maybe I'll go away and correlate that afterwards. That would be really interesting. So this is from the World Happiness Report from Gallup, 2018. So is Germany in the top 20? I've got the top 20 here. Germany is in there, and it is 18, 17, 16, 15th. And it has a score of 6.965. You're welcome. I'm glad I had the answer to that. If it had been below the top 20, I wouldn't have had any idea. So that's just interesting as well. I wanted to do a comparison, actually, of happiness levels and productivity in the UK, given that we've got the productivity numbers. But I couldn't find any measures that went back beyond 2005. So I actually found some correlations, but given that generally since 2005 we've been kind of on a level, I don't think that it relates in and through. So if anybody knows of any longer running happiness surveys, I'd be really interested to know that, because I'm quite sad and I want to find correlations. So I think this is a business case for happiness and can be pulled together in and through. And because all good talks have to end with a recommendation for a book, I recommend The Puzzle Ninja. It has nothing to do with productivity, but it's a fantastic puzzle book, okay? it takes you through histories of puzzle. It's great. So if you're interested in a book, that's it. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, Liz.
I'm really curious as to whether there are any studies which actually show the causality.
No, and it is so correlation is not causality.
Yeah, and I'm thinking
And
that
are
if
they
I were
round the other
happier,
way?
I would feel safe. Therefore, I would probably be more autonomous. And I can see bits of each reflecting.
Absolutely. So certainly historically, there was the view that happiness came from success. So people were successful in their business life, work life, and happiness came from that. And there's certainly been a turnaround in the view that actually it's the other way around, that happiness drives it through. But I haven't seen any evidence of the causation level, merely the correlation.
Because we're all British. And if you ask me whether I'm happy, I'm not going to go, yeah, I'm really happy. I'm going to go, that's okay. And I'm wondering whether you can target things like autonomy and then get success and productivity and inspiration out of them, even when people are like, yeah, I'm really sad. I also know that sometimes stressed people can be their most creative.
Yeah. So there's good stress as well. So there are a number of ways of measuring happiness that I didn't go into there that are around the positive psychology extra pieces that are more around those things of measuring autonomy, measuring those things and taking those as a guide to happiness. But there's almost an assumption underneath that they lead to it as well. So there are quite a lot of studies that look at those things, but again, I don't believe there's a correlation through. There's not a causation proved that I've seen. Yes.
I think if you treat it as an interesting puzzle game, it has value. If you treat it as having anything to do with reality, it's more dubious. I mean, and the happiness index itself actually measures contentment based on Likert scales.
Yes.
Right? And it's been heavily criticised. If you look at the work coming out of the neurocognition guys, who are basically saying this is just another example of neoliberalism. Yeah, that's the criticism of behavioural economics in general, right? That it's a matter of contentment as the goal, right? And you've only got about 10 or 15 years of people even trying to measure happiness, whereas you've got centres of productivity.
Yeah.
So you can't make any, even if you had a correlation, the correlation would be meaningless because of the period, right? And I think the third thing is you can't scale from a nation to a company, right? Yeah, you can't say in any way that being productive is linked to happiness, right? At a company level or a work group level from something
So-
on a national consensus.
So most of the studies that I talked about were on companies, not on a national level. So I guess I started being interested in this because of the national debate, so which is why I brought it back to the national level at the end. But most of the studies are at a company level. Now, I tried, as I talked through, to point out where there are flaws in these studies and they're only looking at one company and other pieces like that. Do I believe there's an utter proof between happiness and productivity? I don't. Do I believe that there's a certain amount of evidence pointing in that direction? Yeah, I do. So it depends on how much proof you want to do that and how much you believe that actually creating a good work environment is worthwhile in and of itself.
But if I look at studies that we've completed on blue light services in Newcastle, yeah? So we've looked at blue light services and stress levels on police firearms, on fire brigade and on ambulance, right? All the evidence coming out of that, which is narrative-based abductive research without Likert scales, so people don't know what the right answer is, which is another problem, right? Basically says that the stress and the mental breakdown is coming from rules and regulations designed to make people safer. It's not coming from the job. Yeah? Secondly, people aren't happy in the job, but they find the job worthwhile. Right? And happiness and things in terms of productivity, right? In different contexts, you may be extremely unhappy, but what you're doing you think is the correct thing to do.
Which is why one of the drivers that we were talking about was that worthwhile piece.
I'm basically saying from a competitive point, there ain't any such thing as drivers on human motivation anyway, right? What you've got is an emergent property of so many different interactions from so many different partners, yeah, that you can never ever say, if you do this, you will achieve that result.
Do you think that the big circle of kind of causes is a good place to maybe look at for running probes?
I think it's worth looking at for running probes, all right? The danger is you get these simplistic recipes, all right? So we know, I mean, I put happiness consultants up there with snake oil salesmen and the like, all right? And there's a lot of people selling happiness, you know, look at the management 3.0 nonsense, all right? Your people basically said if you just put people in the environment and make them happy, they'll become more productive. And there is absolutely zero evidence whatsoever to support that, right? And it's the same as you see with NICE guidelines in the UK. People are looking at single morbidities to design care regimes when actually most people suffer multiple morbidities, at which point the correlation, for example, between, say, statin prescription and heart failure breaks down completely when you add in diabetes and other factors, right? So again, what you've got is this appalling desire people have to create simplistic causal patterns between things they can control and outcomes, right? And to my mind, it sets things back on taking forward.
You can be fairly simplistic about it. If you go into a company, I mean, I agree that correlation is not causation, absolutely. And I don't argue that there's no evidence. But I still think if you go into a company that is taking social responsibility towards its employees, the employees are going to naturally be happier and they will potentially stay longer. I think that's something you can see. You can change things and see if you get turnover, higher turnover, if you get people taking more time off sick. I think those are perfectly reasonable proxy measures of how happy someone is. I don't think it's completely meaningless. I think
Yet the meaninglessness is implying you can improve productivity by making people happy in general.
Oh,
right?
okay. Well,
And that's the point. That's what you're seeing coming out. The way we achieve productivity.
Sorry,
So I'm getting the sign that we need to finish now, but I'm quite happy for us to continue the debate.